on. Though, so to what extent we can use this as a historical record for Singapore, it's more like, it's just like a cultural history in which Singapore plays a very important role. We can't use it as facts. We can't use it for dates and names even. We can say that this was the image of Singapore which people had in 1612. They thought of Singapore as this great ancient civilization. And they thought it was still having ruins. But we also have Arab, Chinese, Indian, Javanese, Vietnamese, and Portuguese records to go along with these things. Arab records go back to the 10th, 11th centuries when we all have the ancient camphor tree. This is the mystical camphor tree, which had great significance for the Arabs and the Persians as well. They thought of camphor as being a great kind of medical ingredient. And so they, in their old manuscripts, this is the camphor tree with angels dancing around it. China, of course, we have the various records from Cheng He period in particular, but also going back to 1330s with Wang Dayuan. And then, of course, we have the Indian records, which go back to the, all the way back to the period of the, well, back to the Ramayana over 2,000 years ago of the Singapore area. We have the inscriptions with the Singapore stone and other ones. And then we have the Javanese records. This is the palm leaf manuscript which mentions Temasek as one of the territories of Majapahit, 1365. So Singapore pops up over and over again. Now we have Arab sources on Southeast Asia, but they've kind of fade out the further east you get. These are the trade, various trade routes mentioned in the Arab sources. Whoops, sorry. Of people going back and forth. There's a lot of trade, of course, over to Gujarat and the west coast of India. Many fewer routes going across the Bay of Bengal, and then none of these record actually preserve any Arab knowledge of how to get to China. So if you look at the 1001 Nights, Alf Layla wa Layla, about Sinbad the sailor, the 7 voyages of Sinbad, 3 of his voyages went to the Straits of Malacca. One goes to Kala, which was that Kedah area. The other 2 he mentions finding things like a dugong and so on. So Sinbad definitely went to the Southeast Asia region at least 3 times. He didn't go to China. China is not in the 1000 Nights and a Night. So it's not part of the Persian mythology of the early 9th century. When, no, at least that's when the 1000 Nights is set during the Caliphate of Harun al-Rashid. Arab travelers who went to China usually went overland, according to those texts. We know that there was an Arab and Persian settlement in Guangzhou at this time, but it's not well recorded in the Arab or Persian texts. Interesting. Then there are other people like Abu Dulaf, who went on an embassy to China. So no mention of China. Of course, the Ramayana mentions the Malaya. That's one of the places in the Malaya, in the Ramayana. And Yawadvipa, Java. Mahamalaya was a big mountain somewhere in this area, a noble mountain. Malaya Dvipa has mines of precious stones and gold, so these all fit with the reality. The Ramayana reliefs, of course, were popular in Java in the 9th century. The Srivijaya, this is the inscription of the conquest of the Straits of Malacca by Rajendra Chola in 1025. And these are all the place names. It mentions Malayur, that's Malaya, Malayu kingdom. It mentions Srivijaya separately, mentions the king of Kadaram. And it mentions the king of Kadaram as being the most important son, Granma Vijaya Tungawaraman. It took his large heap of treasures from Kedah and captured his war gate and took him back to India. And he disappeared and was never written about again. So this is the temple. That's the inscription on the foundation. This is Rajendra Chola here being congratulated by Shiva for his conquest. So he built this big temple. It was obviously a big deal for the Tamil kingdom of the early 11th century. And so Kedah, for the next century, was probably an Indian vice-royalty location. And that's when they built these temples. That's when they built these Hindu temples like this. These are all from the 11th century. The older temples are all Buddhist. 11th century, they start building Hindu temples. The Tamils were Hindu for the most part. And so then you get these Ganeshas. You get some Arab coins, at least one. I only know of one, actually. One Arab coin there. And we get the Tang Dynasty wares, just like on the Belitung shipwreck and in South Thailand and so on. So Kedah definitely was a major trading port. For the Chinese records, we get the most references to Southeast Asia in general. All the way back to the 1st century, Qin Shi Huang wanted to conquer Vietnam in order to get access to the maritime trading routes. They wanted to get things like kingfisher's feathers, which were still in demand in Europe in the 19th century. This is a catalog from the 19th century. You can buy your birds of paradise feathers and so on from a catalog. And but merchants in China were seen as being parasites. According to Confucius, merchants were the lowest of the low. They were worse than being a farmer. It was more honorably a farmer or a soldier than a merchant. And so when they needed soldiers, they conscripted merchants and caitiffs. It was translated merchants and scoundrels to go together to fight against the Vietnamese. So they wanted the emperor to force everyone to stay on the farm and not to want gold and jade. And this had a major impact on Singapore in the 14th century when the Ming came into power, interestingly enough. So you could be a soldier or a farmer. You should never be a merchant. But that was the northern Chinese attitude. The southern Chinese attitude was much more open to the sea and was much more open to this kind of achieved status again through trade. Because the scholars were all Confucianists, they didn't record anything about commerce. We hardly have any data about Chinese economic history. We know there were merchants, but we only know about them because they were exiled to the southern colonies. And we know that already the Chinese merchants were starting to lure nobles to invest with them by the early 2nd century BCE. And they were interested in southern luxuries. That's why they wanted the Southeast Asian luxury items, things like rhinoceros horn, pearls, coral, incense. So when they had to deal with the foreigners, they usually sent out eunuchs. So the foreign embassies usually were eunuchs. So that, of course, explains why Chang He was selected, partly because he was a eunuch. So they let the eunuchs take care of foreign relations because they wouldn't pollute the future generations of Chinese. And so, as it says, they sailed on ships belonging to the foreigners. The merchant ships of the barbarians are used to transfer the Chinese to their destination. Chinese didn't start sailing to Southeast Asia until the Song dynasty, probably. So there are these other references to a merchant who carefully calculated the silks and brocades, which they used to trade with the Kunlun Po. Again, I mentioned these. The Kunlun seems to mean Southeast Asian maritime peoples. Po may mean Prahu. So he was a merchant. We know there was a mercantile class, but other than that, we know nothing about them, except they existed. But they were the writers thought of all the precious things in the world, none are better than those of the southern barbarians, the Southeast Asians. Merchant ships arrive from afar and bring these things to the southern provinces. So that's why Tonkin, Hanoi, and Guangdong are rich and well stocked. And there are these other records about this. We know that Chinese were sojourning in Southeast Asia around this time because there are those who died in Southeast Asia. So then the merchants, there was a rule that if their relatives didn't come and claim their property within 3 months, then the government would take them. That's how we know they existed, because there was this imperial order that said that they shouldn't be so harsh. If somebody dies overseas, so there were overseas Chinese somewhere in this region, and if their relatives don't come within 3 months, you should still let them claim their goods back. That's the only way we know they exist, however. And that's around the same time as the Belitung shipwreck. So we have all these different distribution maps. This is quite interesting for students to look at. You can get all this stuff off the internet, where the different kinds of commodities were, which parts of Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean had which types of items, like the tortoise shell that I mentioned, or like the that were of interest to the Chinese. Now, one of the earliest pieces of evidence for trade with India is pottery. That's why we spent so much time on pottery yesterday. This particular kind of ware is one of the oldest kind of trade wares. found in Southeast Asia, and it has this really long name, Romano-Indian rouletted ware. And so Romano-Indian, it's found in West Java, it's found in Bali, it's found in South Vietnam, found in various other places. It's called Romano-Indian. Let's start with rouletted first. Rouletted because it has a design made by rolling a wheel around on the clay. It's called rouletting. This is a very Roman technique. It was not used in India, China, Southeast Asia. And so it is found in South India. It was made in South India. It's been found in the Madras area, Chennai area. But it's imitating a Roman technique. So that's why it's called Romano-Indian. It was the Roman potters imitating Roman pottery 2,000 years ago and then exporting it to Southeast Asia. So already there's this link between Rome, India, Southeast Asia 2,000 years ago. So this is a kind of international connections, or you could call it early globalization, already 2,000 years ago.